Hello students, today we are reading part 2 of A Triumph of Surgery from your supplementary reader Footprints Without Feet. Let me recap the story we read till now. James Herriot, a veterinarian doctor, narrates the story of Tricky, the dog, and how he gets better. He saw Tricky one day with his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. James was shocked to see Tricky's appearance. Mrs. Pumphrey quickly explained that she thought Tricky was suffering from malnutrition, so she fed him some malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. She also confessed that she fed him some cream cakes and chocolates. James realized the situation was bad. He knew Tricky could never say no to food. However, as he watched Mrs. Pumphrey walk away with Tricky, he thought it wouldn't be long before he heard from her. Sure enough, Mrs. Pumphrey called a few days later. James had already made a plan by then. So he came to Mrs. Pumphrey's house and suggested Tricky be removed to his clinic for 2 weeks. Mrs. Pumphrey almost fainted at the suggestion. Grabbing hold of Tricky, James carried him to his car. The whole household was in an uproar. The staff rushed about getting blankets, bowls, clothes, and toys for Tricky. From his rearview mirror, he saw the entire household standing on the road in tears. Now, let us read and find out what happened at the surgery. Children, open page number 3. Yes. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. The other dogs, after sniffing around him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. I made a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings, and on the third, he began to whimper when he heard the dogs in the yard. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately engulfed by Joe. The greyhound and his friends, after rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. There was the unusual headlong rush, followed by the sounds of high-speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. Yes. So as soon as they reached the hospital, all the other dogs gathered around him. Around whom? Around the doctor. Tricky looked at all of them, and when the doctor put him down on the carpet, he couldn't even move. The other dogs then sniffed him and thought to themselves that he was a very uninteresting object and that there was no use standing there and left. Then the narrator made the bed for Tricky in a warm box along with the other dogs. For 2 days, the narrator kept him just on water and nothing else. On the second day, he roamed around looking at the place around him, and on the third day, he was also making noise to let the people in the hospital know that he too wanted to go out with the other dogs. When the narrator opened the door, Tricky quickly came out and was surrounded by Joe, who was a greyhound, and his friends. Again, after sniffing him for a moment, all of them left for the garden where Tricky followed them. Later in the evening, the narrator was present at the dinner time and was watching all of them, especially when they were served food. When Tristan, his cousins, served him food, the food slopped. All of them were eating with great speed because they knew if they didn't finish quickly, then the other dog, after finishing his meal, would come to eat their meal. Coming to the next page. When they had finished, Tricky took a walk round the shining bowls, licking casually inside one or two of them. Next day, an extra bowl was put out for him, and I was pleased to see him jostling his way towards it. From then on, his progress was rapid. He had no medicinal treatment of any kind, but all day he ran about with the dogs, joining in their friendly scrimmages. He discovered the joy of being bowled over, trampled on, squashed every few minutes. He became an accepted member of the gang, an unlikely, silky little object among the shaggy crew, fighting like a tiger for his share at mealtime and hunting rats in the old hen house at night. He had never had such a time in his life. All the while, Mrs. Pumphrey hovered anxiously in the background, ringing a dozen times a day for the latest bulletins. I dodged the questions about whether his cushions were being turned regularly or his correct coat worn according to the weather. But I was able to tell her that the little fellow was out of danger and convulsing rapidly. The word convulsing seemed to do something to Mrs. Pumphrey. She started to bring around fresh eggs, 2 dozens at a time, to build up Tricky's strength. For a happy period, my partners and I had 2 eggs each for breakfast. But when the bottles of wine began to arrive, the real possibilities of the situation began to dawn on the household. It was to enrich Tricky's blood. Lunch became a ceremonial occasion with 2 glasses of wine before and several during the meal. So what he says, when everybody finished their food, Tricky went around looking at the shining bowls and also licked a few bowls. The very next day, an extra bowl was put for him, and the narrator was happy to see him running towards his bowl. Then he started getting better really quick. He did not require any medicines and started playing with the other dogs the whole day. They all used to play with each other, bump into each other, walk over each other, and squash each other. All the other dogs accepted him as a family member, although he was very different from others, as he was very well taken care of by his owner, and the others were not. He also used to fight for his meals with his fellow dogs who were much larger in size than him. At night, he would also hunt rats in the hen house. He was enjoying as he had never done such things before. All this while, Mrs. Pumphrey used to call more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky. And Mr. Harriet used to avoid questions about the coats, beds, etc. But he told her that Tricky was doing very good and was recovering fast. Mrs. Pumphrey wanted Tricky to recover fast. She started sending 2 dozen eggs every day for him. But Mr. Harriet and his partners would have 2 eggs for breakfast. They had the eggs which were sent for Tricky for breakfast. Then to improve the quality of blood, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in bottles of wine. Then it became Mr. Harriet's habit to have 2 glasses of wine before lunch and a few along with it. Now, shall we discuss the word meanings, children? Yes. Pack, what does pack mean? Pack is a group of dogs. Sniffing, smelling, whimper, cry, engulfed, surrounded. Greyhound is a hunting dog. Surplus, excess. Slopped, spilled. Headlong, plunging. Liable, likely. Scrimmages is fights. Trammed is crushed. Hover, stay close. Convulsing, recovering. Yes. Now coming to the next page, page number 5. We could hardly believe it when the brandy came to put a final edge on Tricky's constitution. For a few nights, the fine spirit was rolled around, inhaled, and reverently drunk. There were days of deep content, starting well with the extra eggs in the morning, improved and sustained by the midday wine, and finishing luxuriously round the fire with the brandy. It was a temptation to keep Tricky on as a permanent guest, but I knew Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering, and after a fortnight, felt compelled to phone and tell her that the little dog had recovered and was awaiting collection. Within minutes, about 30 feet of gleaming black metal drew up outside the surgery. The chauffeur opened the door, and I could make out the figure of Mrs. Pumphrey almost lost in the interior. Her hands were tightly clasped in front of her. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet, do tell me the truth. Is he really better?" "Yes, he's fine. There's no need for you to get out of the car. I'll go and fetch him." I walked through the house into the garden. A mass of dogs was hurtling round and round the lawn in their midst, ears flapping, tail waving, was the little golden figure of Tricky. In 2 weeks, he had been transformed into a lithe, hard-muzzled animal. He was keeping up well with the pack, stretching out in great bounds, his chest almost brushing the ground. I carried him back along the passage to the front of the house. The chauffeur was still holding the car door open. And when Tricky saw his mistress, he took off my arms in a tremendous leap and sailed into Mrs. Pumphrey's lap. She gave a startled "oh" and then had to defend herself as he swarmed over her, licking her face and barking. During the excitement, I helped the chauffeur to bring out the beds, toys, cushions, coats, bowls, none of which had been used. As the car moved away, Mrs. Pumphrey leaned out of the window. Tears shone in her eyes. Her lips trembled. "Oh, Mr. Harriet," she cried, "how can I ever thank you? This is a triumph of surgery." So what happened here? Mrs. Pumphrey started sending in brandy, alcohol. At that time, Mr. Harriet was not able to believe that. What he was not able to believe that actually Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted them to give brandy to Tricky. They shared it amongst themselves. Some days Mr. Harriet used to feel very happy as he would start his day with extra eggs. Then he would have a few glasses of wine in the afternoon, and then ending in the day with brandy in the evening. Because of all the things that were being sent for Tricky, Mr. Harriet was really tempted to keep him as a permanent guest at the surgery. He wanted to keep Tricky at the surgery only. He really wanted that Tricky should stay with them forever. But then he realized that Mrs. Pumphrey, who was like a mother to Tricky, was really suffering and really wanted Tricky to come back soon. So after 15 days, Tricky was ready to go back home, and Mr. Harriet called up Mrs. Pumphrey to come and pick him up. Within few minutes, a long black car came outside. When the chauffeur opened the door, Mrs. Pumphrey was sitting inside, really nervous as well as excited. She was asking with a nervousness in her voice that was Tricky really better? To which the doctor replied positively. Then Mr. Harriet went inside to get Tricky. When Mr. Harriet went to the garden behind the house, what happened? He saw all the dogs moving around in the garden, and Tricky was sitting between them. He had recovered wonderfully in 2 weeks. He was looking much healthier, playing with the other dogs, and his chest was touching the ground. He had become a good muscular dog within 2 weeks. When Mr. Harriet took Tricky to the front of the house, he saw that the chauffeur was still holding the door of the car, and as soon as Tricky saw his mistress, he was overjoyed. He ran. He ran away and jumped into the lap of Mrs. Pumphrey and started licking her face, barking in excitement. While all this was happening, the chauffeur and Mr. Harriet got all his stuff out to the car, which had not been used during the treatment in the last 15 days. When Mrs. Pumphrey was leaving, she leaned out of the window and said to Mr. Harriet with tears of joy. And what did she say? That she could not thank him enough for what he had done. This is a triumph of surgery. Meant that the treatment that was given to Tricky had been successful. Now let us discuss the word meanings, children. Constitution. What does the word constitution mean? Here it means body structure. Tricky's body structure. Reverently, respectfully. Content, satisfaction. Sustained, maintained. Gleaming is shining. Hurtling, running. Lithe is flexible. Chauffeur. Who is a chauffeur? He is a paid driver. Swarmed, climbed. Startled, shocked. Tremendous, huge. Yes. With this, we come to the end of part 2 of this lesson. And what was the lesson? A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Harriet. Thank you for watching this video, children. Stay home and stay healthy.